The story begins with the main character named Leslie being dragged into a building to be sacrificed. The girl desperately calls her mom, dad, and sister to help her, but they just stood by and watched. The protagonist's father was unhappy that her daughter was being dragged away too slowly and ordered that Leslie finally be thrown down. The man who was pulling the main character said he was sorry and said to follow him, then opened the door of the building. Leslie grabbed the door and said she didn't want to die but wanted to live and begged for mercy. The man tensed up, and the girl's father was not happy about it. Then he grabbed a spear out of the guard's hands and hit Leslie with it. The protagonist fell down and heard the words of her father that she did not know that her destiny was to die for her sister. Then the door closed, and Leslie couldn't believe that she was just going to die like that. Leslie was a sacrifice to save her sister, and the girl didn't realize if she could even survive this fire. Suddenly, a hand appeared from somewhere, and then a voice came to the ears of the protagonist, which addressed the girl. After that, there were more and more voices, and they all wanted to help the girl and save her. The ghostly hands embraced Leslie and threw her upwards, because of which the girl fell out of the window of the building. The main character's life was dedicated to her sister's life. Leslie recalled how her father told her that because she was bickering with her sister, would remain today without food, and also forbade her to leave her room. Her mother didn't like Leslie either and scolded her at the first opportunity. The girl's mom turned to Leslie and said that the tutor told her that the main character couldn't answer the question correctly. Leslie replied that she couldn't answer the question because she hadn't learned the topic yet, but the girl's mom ordered her not to be sassy and to answer normally. Leslie's mother thought that the only use of the girl was to study, because she had to cope with at least such elementary things to help her sister. Ellie, who was Leslie's sister, told her that Leslie was embarrassing her in front of a lot of people and that she had twisted the words of God. The main character tried to change her sister's mind and told her that she was deluded and it was just a mistake. Ellie replied that she didn't care if it was a mistake or not, because Leslie had blackened her name and promised that if she was responsible for it. After that, Allie grabbed the girl by the hair and said that Leslie was not doing her best, because after all, she was here for Allie. The main character dreamed of finally being loved, but instead all she got was constant pointing and cold stares. Leslie flew straight into the arms of the sea, but somehow miraculously she found herself on the shore. The protagonist found herself in bed and realized that she was still alive, after which she cried because no one had ever considered her part of the family. Leslie sat on the bed and thought that she was scared, but she decided that from now on everything would be different, and she would give up all her dreams of being loved. The protagonist looked at her hands and suddenly they turned black, and it was black magic. In the Rucardian Empire, each noble family has a unique divine power or magic. The Sperado family secretly possessed the most powerful magic, namely the ability to control darkness. However, the Sperado family gradually stopped having children who possessed black magic, and gradually the lineage began to die out. Leslie heard that more than 100 years had passed since the last child with this power was born. The girl wondered if it had something to do with the voices she had heard, and so decided to find answers in the library she wanted to sneak into. First, Leslie needed a power that could protect her. The laws of the Empire state that every family is obligated to support their child. The protagonist still had 6 years left before she came of age, so if she tried to escape now, the prince would use that law to bring her back, and so if she wasn't sure, the prince would let her live. Either way, Leslie needed to think of something, and so she decided to leave the room. Suddenly, the dark energy that was under the girl's bed rustled, but Leslie calmed it down and told her it was okay. The main character left her room and walked down the stairs and down a gorgeous hallway. Leslie began to remember moments from the past, when she was told not to walk in this place because such a wretch like her should not walk around in this room, and everyone thought Leslie was disgusting. The girl was like moss growing in a dark place, and her sister was like a warm ray when Leslie was her shadow. The protagonist remembered her mother putting her in front of a mirror and ordering her to look in it and asking her what kind of child she was. Leslie replied that she was a useless child. The mother said that was true and asked what her calling was, and the girl replied that her calling was to live for her sister. When Leslie remembered this, she decided that from now on, she would not listen to anyone and would not talk to anyone. Suddenly, the girl heard her father and Elle talking. Elle was indignant that she had to wait a whole 6 months. The prince calmed her down and told her that he knew when the time was right. Elle was very angry and couldn't understand why her sister Leslie hadn't burned because she couldn't awaken her powers. She also added that if the sacrifice was successful, she would finally be able to fully utilize her powers. Allie was worried about what people would think of her if she was unable to use her powers properly, and asked her parents if they really thought she would be able to raise their status with such pathetic sorcery. The protagonist was surprised that her sister had also awakened black magic. Ellie asked the prince if the reason Leslie was still alive was because she was precious to him. The parents replied that this child was born for her sake, and if Ellie had not awakened her powers, the prince would have made her a maid of honor in the imperial palace. But since she had received her powers, they gave birth to Leslie to transfer her magic to Ellie. The girl asked what would happen if Leslie's powers awakened too. Her parents answered that it was simply impossible, because Ella's golden hair and green eyes were the true traits of the Sperato family. Leslie was nothing like the Sperato family. Her hair was like an old woman's, and people born with such hair are often the luckiest victims. Ellie asked if the prince had purposely sent Leslie along with her the night she met Sir Arlendo. The prince replied that if she hadn't been a victim, he would have made her a maid for Ellie, and if she hadn't spilled tea on the prince, she would have made her debut at the party then. The main character realized that her life, her death, and even her birth was planned out, and everything that happens in Leslie's life was for her sister Ellie. If her sister didn't awaken her powers, she would become a maid of honor in the imperial palace, and they were going to burn and sacrifice Leslie. The protagonist ran to her room and started crying bitterly. Then she made a decision. Leslie was going to leave the palace, but the prince wanted to stop her and asked her where she was going so early in the morning, but the girl kept silent. The prince, seeing that she was silent, asked if she wanted to answer his question and called her useless trash. The protagonist asked if she was useless because it did not seem so to her, because if she was not at hand, they would be in a predicament. The prince was angry and said that Leslie had become too bold, and if it was because she was still alive, and if it was true, she could use a bit of a mental break, and after all, it was for her sister and her family. Leslie replied that if it was for family and her sister, then let him jump into the fire himself, and she wasn't going to do it anymore. Prince wanted to stop Leslie leaving, but dark forces stopped him. The main character came to the carriage and wanted to get into it, but the servant stopped her and said that it was a carriage for Mrs. Ellie. The girl replied that she knew, but still asked to be taken to the temple. The servant replied that Leslie was crazy, and Mrs. Ellie would be here soon, after which he grabbed the girl by the arm and ordered her to get out of the carriage. Leslie slapped the man on the cheek and indignantly asked him how he dared to grab her hand and from whom he had learned such manners, and how dare he raise his hand on a lady. All the servants could not understand what was going on, because yesterday, Leslie could not even utter a word. The protagonist asked, since when the servants in the mansion interfere with their master. All the servants bowed, and the man said that the carriage was for Mrs. Ellie. The girl replied that it didn't make any difference, and if they didn't want to drive it, she would drive herself. The servant was very surprised and quickly hustled to take the girl to the temple. Leslie replied not to make him tell her twice. The protagonist rode in the carriage and couldn't believe she had slapped someone, but still, she didn't have to worry about the people who had neglected and tormented her. Now, Leslie didn't know what she would do in the future, but for now, she was going to meet the Princess of Monsters, a house with a history richer than the imperial family and existing even before the founding of the empire. People believe that the ancestors in their lineage were monsters, and that's because no one can originate their power. Salvador was famous for her power, and it is said that she was so strong that in all wars, she always fought on the front lines. Even if, living in confinement, knew about her, because she was the first of the Salvadores who single-handedly broke into the battlefield and tore off the king's head with her bare hands. It's also said that Princess Salvador is more powerful than any high-ranking house like Sperato. Since Princess Salvador has been hidden from view, only 1 or 2 legends have survived to this day. Rumor has it that her 2 sons have also inherited their mother's unthinkable power. Their power is only growing, and even Leslie doesn't know how strong they are. The protagonist was afraid of whether she would be able to persuade the princess, but still decided that she had nothing to fear. All this time, Leslie lived under the same roof with real monsters. Even if it is a man who can tear off the head with his bare hands, it is not a monster who throws his child to burn alive. At this moment, the servant said that they had arrived at the temple, and Leslie hurriedly jumped out of the carriage. Suddenly, she turned around and saw the servant extend his hand to her as she was getting out, but she didn't use it, which made the girl feel awkward, and she decided she needed to learn some manners. When the protagonist entered the temple, she heard two ladies talking about the fact that it seems that Princess Salvador did not arrive today on the island of Degi. Many people had come to the island to greet the princess, and it was a pity that she didn't show up. Princess Salvatore is known for not receiving guests. Even the imperial family cannot meet with her. But even so, Leslie heard that she attends the annual meeting on the island of Degi. The protagonist was very upset because the next meeting may be in a month or even 2, and the Marquis said that the next sacrifice will be in 6 months. The girl reassured herself that everything was all right, because she had not come here, only that's why she turned to the nun and asked to look at the archives of the Sparado family. The family records of each family are kept in the temple, and they contain information about all deaths within the family, and the reason why the Sparado family wants to sacrifice Leslie was definitely in this book. The nun replied that if the girl was referring to the family book, would she be able to prove that she was a member of the Sparado family? And if she could not prove that she was a member of the family, she would not be able to see the book. The nun asked if she had any proof of Leslie's identity, even a trinket, and if the girl could provide something with the stamp of her family's coat of arms, as proof she would certainly help her find the book. Sister Ellie may have the coat of arms stamp, but Leslie has never been allowed to even raise her eyes to the coat of arms stamp. The protagonist asked the nun if she could confirm her identity with a carriage because it has the family crest on it. After that, the nun and the girl went outside and Leslie pointed to the carriage. The nun was pleased and said that it was the carriage of Mrs. Ellie, the daughter of the Sparado family, and that was more than enough to confirm Leslie's identity. The woman also said that she had heard that Leslie wasn't feeling well and they couldn't go out, but it was still nice to see that the girl was okay. After a while, the protagonist entered the archives, and the nun said that the last entry were written in the language of this empire. Then he handed the girl 2 books written in Highlander. The woman said that if she needed help with translation, she could call him, but the girl replied that it was fine and she could read Gorian. The nun was very surprised and said that Leslie is so her, but she already knows how to translate from Gorski, and it's amazing because she usually starts learning it at the academy. The main character was very embarrassed because it was the first time she was praised so much, because while Leslie's sister was busy being a princess, Leslie was studying hard. The nun said that she was probably bothering the girl a lot and asked her not to hurry and to let her know when she decided to leave. When the woman left, Leslie began to reread the books and find information about who had died at an early age, and if the stories about the sacrifices were true, then there must be quite a few people who had died in their youth. The last person who wielded black magic was born over 100 years ago, so we need to check what events happened before that. Suddenly, the protagonist stopped at a line in the book, and it said that in the 231 imperial year, on April 3rd, Leah Sparado, at the age of 12, died as a result of a fall, and the funeral lasted 2 days. 263 imperial year on January 23rd, Lytton Sparado, who was the second son at age 15, died of an illness, and the funeral lasted 2 days. 301 imperial year, December 7th. Pidal Sparado drowned at age 11 while boating, and the funeral lasted 2 days. Death by fall, drowning, robbery, unknown incurable disease, and a bunch of different reasons why all these people died. But they all died before reaching adulthood, and all had brothers or sisters. There was a funeral, for which they allocated a day, and some children were not honored, and this little and even the funeral of a commoner lasts for 3 days, and so alive or dead, Leslie will always be disadvantaged because, being a member of this family, she will die for the good of the family. At that moment, the protagonist realized that those voices she was hearing were the voices of the burned children who were trapped in the fire. Leslie cried and couldn't understand why she was born into such powerful magic. But suddenly the realization came to her that the children who were sacrificed had been storing up anger for the last millennia, and Leslie was created to avenge them all. The protagonist would have to make sure that nothing was left of the Sparado family and avenge all the children. Leslie ran out of the archives and decided that she didn't want to see this anymore, and she needed to go to the princess to meet with Princess Salvador. But if she refused to meet with her, Leslie was ready to beg for days and weeks. Suddenly, the protagonist tripped on a handkerchief that was on the floor, causing her to fall. At that moment, a guy ran up to her and asked if she was okay, and when he saw that the girl was okay, he was very happy. After that, he shook Leslie off and gave her a handkerchief. The protagonist was very grateful for his kindness, but the guy replied that it was nothing and not worth thanking and wished to be careful next time. The protagonist was very embarrassed and watched the guy leave, then went outside to get into the carriage. When Leslie arrived, her sister Ellie threw herself into her arms. The protagonist could not understand what was going on because her sister always hated her. Suddenly, it all became clear to Leslie when she saw the son of Emperor Alando, and that was the reason for such a strange behavior of Ellie. Her sister said that she had no idea how worried she was when Leslie suddenly got into the carriage and disappeared, and started wondering about the main character's well-being. That picture was fake and disgusting, so Leslie pushed Allie. Her sister said that Leslie had no idea how worried she was about her, and how she could do that to her, after which she started crying. The protagonist noticed the angry looks on her face, but she knew that everything that was happening was just a cheap production to get attention. Ellie thought about how Leslie dared to act like that when the prince was here and decided to bring her sister down to earth. The main character realized that everyone would be discussing her instead of Ellie, and suddenly she remembered how in the past she was thrown into a room and told that the Marquis had ordered not to give if food as punishment. All the servants laughed at Leslie and said that they could not do anything about it, and that the girls should have behaved well, and blamed Leslie for all the troubles. The protagonist thought about the fact that they are all the same Marquis, Marquise, Ellie, everyone who works for them, and so the girl decided that from now on, she will no longer be their victim. Suddenly, Leslie turned to Allie and asked if she was really worried about her. Allie was very surprised and thought to herself that shouldn't Leslie have just quietly left now. Her sister replied that of course she was worried about Leslie, then hugged her. The protagonist replied that Allie loved her so much that she threw her into the fire. Ellie ordered Leslie to shut up and asked what she would do if the prince heard that, and added that it seemed if whined about every little thing. The protagonist smirked and asked how come she was saying all the same things the Marquis was saying. Ellie's eyes read panic and couldn't understand where Leslie got that power from. The girl leaned over to her sister and asked what if the Marquis found out about her power, and then she would bring glory to the house and the Marquis would give her all the love and attention. Ellie trembled and fell to the ground. The main character put her finger to her lips and said that she didn't need the love of this monster at all, but at the same time, Ellie would probably get in trouble, after which Leslie left. The girl bowed in front of the prince, but suddenly Ellie ran up to Leslie and grabbed her arm and tore her dress. The protagonist looked at the prince and sarcastically said that it was a dainty gift from her sister and then left. When Leslie was in her room, a servant burst in and abruptly yanked up the girl's blanket and grabbed her arm. The servant shouted at Leslie and asked how she could behave like that in front of Mrs. Ellie, since the prince almost got it all wrong. Leslie asked what exactly he could have misunderstood. Rhea replied that everyone had heard that and said that she had gotten those burns when she had foolishly played with a teapot on a family vacation. Leslie asked if that was really what she had told her. The maid said that she didn't want to hear the girl's excuse anymore, and no matter how many times Ellie warned her, but Leslie always makes trouble on the spot, and so Ellie got very sad when she told them that. Rhea then grabbed the girl's hand and dragged her to apologize to Mrs. Allie for her lie. The nanny thought that Ellie was very kind, and maybe she would forgive Leslie, but she still deserved to be punished, and this would wean Leslie off lying. The protagonist pushed the maid and replied that she wasn't going anywhere and wouldn't apologize because she wasn't lying. Ellie was the one who left her with those scars, or rather, the entire Sparado family gave her that burn. When the nanny heard that, she concluded that Leslie was crazy. The main character remembered how Rhea told her how she had diligently raised Mrs. Ellie because she was patient, calm, and polite, and even talks like a puppet. The nanny was very unhappy with Leslie's behavior and said she would tell everything to the Marquis. Rhea thought about the fact that even if she had to hurt her, she still had to do her upbringing, and if she did nothing, she would be the sword swinging at the Marquis of Sparado. Nanny asked how Leslie dared to talk to her like that. The girl replied that Rhea could tell the Marquis and the Marquis everything. The nanny asked what Leslie said, and the girl replied that if she wasn't deaf, then let her tell the Marquis and Marquis about her behavior. The protagonist was indifferent to whether the nanny would tell her about her bickering with her or the fact that she asked if she was deaf. Also, Leslie added that if the nanny understood everything, she could leave now because Leslie wanted to rest. Rhea was very angry and wanted to grab the girl's hand again, but the main character's strength prevented the nanny from doing so, causing her to fall to the floor. Leslie was annoyed with the nanny and wanted her to leave as soon as possible. At that moment, Ellie's scream was heard, ordering the nanny to get out of the room. Rhea replied that she couldn't get up, but Ellie didn't care and said that if she couldn't get up, then let her crawl out of here. When the nanny was out the door, an angry Ellie found herself in Leslie's room. Her sister offered the girl some conversation if she replied that she didn't want to talk to her and had nothing to say to her. At that moment, Ellie pulled the blanket off Leslie and threw it on the floor, saying that the main character was disgusting because she hid her power, and because of it she was able to survive that fall from the cliff. Ellie was sure that it was her magic, and she doesn't know how Leslie managed to get her magic, so she ordered her not to use it and just sit in her room. The protagonist asked her sister if she really thought it was her power. Ali replied that it is obviously her power because she is the firstborn in the Sparado family, and she also has blonde hair and green eyes, which are the hallmarks of their family. Her sister looked at Leslie and said that her hair was dull and gray, and after all, Elle thought she was adorable, and so she thought Leslie's grayness was ugly compared to her beauty. Ale also added that even Leslie's dull head had to figure out who was more deserving of the power. The protagonist found it repulsive, and she now knew what Elle's beauty was made of, because the Sparado family's wealth and fame was held on the blood of innocence. Her sister noticed Leslie's frowning face and concluded that she understood what they were worthy of, and said that she would just live like a half-dead mouse for another 6 months. The protagonist asked if she should really go down and tell them everything. Ali interjected, and so if said Rhea that Ali is apparently deaf because she said she would go down and tell the Marquis everything. After all, if Leslie has power, she can show it to them. And so she asked Ellie what she thought the Marquis's reaction would be to that. After all, did Ellie really think it would still be the same Leslie that was thrown into the fire, or would it still be Ellie? At that moment, Leslie opened the door and ordered Ellie to get out before she changed her mind, and if her sister wouldn't disturb her sleep, she would keep it a secret. Ellie shoved Leslie and angrily ran out of the room. When the protagonist slept, she went down to the dining room, and the servants were surprised. After a while, Leslie was brought some unpalatable chowder, and she refused to eat it, ordering them to bring something else that a normal person would eat. The maid replied that the master had said that if she ate any other food, she would gain weight. Leslie replied that she was done with that now and ordered her to bring some normal meat and promised she wouldn't tell who exactly served her the food. After a while, there were many delicious dishes in front of the protagonist, and after a small period of time, there was nothing left of them. Leslie was fed up and satisfied, but suddenly her mother came along with her sister. The Marquise was outraged that the girl had eaten everything herself, but Leslie just took it and left. Marquise couldn't understand what was happening to her, but Allie tried to stop her and told her that Leslie had just lost her mind. Allie told her mother how crazy Leslie was with her yesterday, and if Marquise wasn't careful with her, she might even bite her or hurt her. The protagonist left the palace and went to the Princess Salvadores' house. The coachman informed the girl that they had already arrived, but he could not understand why she needed to go to such a dangerous place, because Princess Salvador is very strong, and she did not lose power because of the demon blood in her blood. The servant also heard that the blood of the current princess is so strong that part of her face is covered with scales and advised her to go back to the mansion. Leslie replied that it was fine and ordered him to wait for her here. The protagonist got out of the carriage and told the soldier who guarded the castle to inform the princess that the daughter of the Sparado family, Leslie Sparado, wants to talk to her. Princess Salvador was informed of the girl's arrival, and she went to the window to look at her. The Duchess was surprised that Leslie was so small and could not realize how old she was because the Duchess's children were always large and tall even when they were small. The princess asked the butler if the Sparado family really had another daughter. Jenna replied that they did have a daughter, and somehow he had bothered to accompany the first prince of the empire when he had a meeting with his fiancée, Lady Sparado. As a result of the meeting, Leslie had been the girl who had accidentally spilled tea on the prince, and it was said that she had not left the mansion since, but he had also heard of her poor health on several occasions before that. The princess recalled how she had once been to one of the balls and heard the Marquis praising his lovely daughter Ellie, and believed that she would bring back the Sparado family to its former glory. The Marquis claimed that Ellie had more than just beauty, and he was very happy when he discovered it in her. The princess thought about the fact that many people disliked the Salvadores for being the only ones who hadn't lost their power since the founding of the empire. Jenna asked Princess Salvador what she was going to do, and she said that Leslie's carriage was behind her, and it was cold, so the princess concluded that she would be leaving soon and ordered Jenna to ignore her. The protagonist had been standing near the gates of the palace for a long time, and so the coachman suggested that she go back because the girl was very cold, and at this rate the Marquis might scold her. Leslie replied that the coachman should go back and leave her here. The servant asked how she would get back without a carriage, because it is very cold here, but if she answered that, she would deal with it somehow. Also, the protagonist ordered the coachman to tell the Marquis that she will spend the night praying to wash away all her sins and not a word about Princess Salvatore. The coachman did not want to please his master, but Leslie said that in any case it was better than to mention Princess Salvatore's name in vain, and if he did not want to be dismissed, then let him quietly inform the Marquis of what Leslie had told him. The man agreed and said that he would tell him so, but asked him not to forget that he was trying to stop Leslie, and if anything happened to her, it would not be his fault. Meanwhile, Princess Salvador was dealing with her work, which had piled up a lot. She wanted to find a suitable child and needed someone reliable so she could get some rest, but her sons couldn't be relied on. They could not be relied on because one of the sons was an exact copy of Princess Salvador and therefore too cavalier, and the other had a very difficult character that made him look like an elephant in a china shop. At this moment, the princess looked out of the window and saw Leslie there, and was very surprised to see her still standing there. The princess thought that her grandfather had told her that the Sparado family had an unusually high mortality rate among second and third children, and she wondered what had made the child so desperate. Meanwhile, the butler told the princess that the meal was served, but she replied that she wanted to eat later because the first thing she wanted to do was to meet her guest, and so she ordered Miss Sparado to be invited to the manor. The protagonist entered the palace and could not get warm in any way, and so the butler brought her a cup of hot tea. Jenna said that the best thing for a young lady like her would be to offer a cup of hot chocolate, but unfortunately, since recently there is no one left in the estate who would prefer such a drink, and so they have only tea. She also added that he put a lot of sugar in the tea to compensate for this, and offered to help herself. Leslie thanked for the tea and took the cup in her hands. The girl felt the warmth and sweet flavor, but accidentally the cup slipped out of her hands and fell to the floor. Leslie began to apologize and said she would be sure to clean it up, for she was afraid of being yelled at. The butler hastened to reassure her and said that everything was all right because the carpet could be cleaned and the tea bought new. And besides, with such frozen hands it was to be expected. After a while, the woman brought Leslie a warm blanket to keep her warm, and also asked her to wait until she brought a second cup of tea. The protagonist touched the soft blanket and noticed that it was as if she was touching a cloud. At that moment, the princess entered the room, and Leslie marveled at her grandeur and how tall she was, for she was taller than the tallest knight the Sparado family had. She told the princess that Leslie was a lovely young lady and even stole the heart of her majordomo in no time. The butler at Princess Salvador's estate introduced herself by saying her name was Jenna Durantes. Leslie thought it was the maid, so she didn't know how to apologize. Jenna said it was okay because it might seem strange to have a female maid. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and treats began to be brought into the room. The princess asked the protagonist the reason why she came to the place called the Estate of the Princess of Monsters. Leslie replied that she came here because she had a request to the princess, and that request was to adopt Leslie. The protagonist begged the Duchess to make her the first lady of the Salvador family. Princess Salvador was very surprised by such a request because she had never had such a request before, except for a few ladies who wanted to fictitiously marry her son. The Duchess noticed Leslie had a look that she knew very well, the eyes of someone who is struggling to live being cornered, and so she decided to ask her why she should adopt her. The protagonist answered that she should adopt her because if she did, she would get what she had always wanted. And at that moment, she showed her powers, and the whole castle went dark. What the princess wanted was a black patron, and with such great power, Leslie could become as powerful as the first black patron. Leslie said that the strongest patron of the empire would be on the Duchess's side. The Duchess laughed and asked how Lady Sparado knew what the Duchess wanted. The protagonist replied that she didn't know it, but she had heard that Princess Salvador had been looking for a little girl in orphanages lately, and Leslie had overheard it somewhere. The princess thanked the girl for the information, because it was like a rat under her roof, and asked why Lady Sparado asked to adopt her. Because if she is from the family Sparado, then not hunger and other terrible hardships, she is not threatened. At this point, the protagonist remembered all the horrors she had faced living in the Sparado family, and replied that she would like the Duchess to protect her until she grew up, because she wanted to be the lady of the family until she was 18, and then she could leave the family and the estate, and would be happy to leave any inheritance and power. Leslie cried and said that she just wanted to grow up, fall in love, and have children with a man she will love. She also wanted to live a life in which she could count all the books she wanted and eat real food. Not a life that was devoted to others, and not a life in which she was sacrificed, but just a normal and ordinary life. The protagonist wanted to live a life that would belong to her, and where she would make her own decisions. And so she asked the princess to accept her into her family. Princess Salvador said that she felt as if there were some other reasons why she wanted to be adopted, and if there were, she wanted to know them. The protagonist said that if she can, she wants to destroy and send the family from the pirate to the bottom with the power of the Duchess. The princess asked if she could ask a few more questions namely why she came to her, and she understood the two reasons Leslie had just told her. And besides, Leslie could go to the royal family, and since she has strong magic, the kingdom could protect her, and the royal family has enough power to punish Leslie's family. The protagonist replied that the punishment the royal family could provide would be minor, since they realized that it would upset the balance between the noble families if one of the families was suddenly destroyed. There's also a good chance that the royal family knows Sparado's past, since it's all been going on for 1,000 years, and so the royal family couldn't not know it. The royals have strong support, and they can gain even more strength and weakness at the expense of the Sparado family if they let them get away with it. Princess Salvador asked Leslie if the girl had thought of all this on her own, and asked how old Leslie was. The protagonist answered that she turned 12 this year, and also said that she is not a genius, but she is a fast learner, and it all came to her while she was struggling to survive. The Duchess thought about the fact that her family is full of serious people, and it would be nice to have such a soft and milky child with them. Leslie is also very educated and seems to grasp everything on the fly, and she is very skinny and looks weak and seems to have low self-esteem. But if they give her lots of love and care, she will shine brighter and become more beautiful than any other child. Besides, Leslie was a dark patron and much to Princess Salvador's liking. Suddenly, the princess asked Leslie if she had ever heard of her before. The protagonist replied that she had heard that the princess had the blood of monsters flowing in her, and that part of her face was covered with scales. The princess replied that, as expected, if she knew about it, and so she was going to take off her mask, and asked Leslie if she was ready for it, because it could be very frightening. Princess Salvador took off her mask, and underneath it was a large scar that she had gotten in a war where she had been betrayed by people she trusted, and that was a long time ago, even before Leslie was born. The princess thought that usually children cry and run away, or at worst faint when they see the princess's scar. But if she wants to be her child, she must have the courage not to cry when she sees the scar. The main character asks if her scar hurts because it looks very painful. The princess asked if Leslie was afraid, but the girl said she wasn't afraid, and had a similar scar. The Duchess replied that her scar doesn't hurt anymore because it is very old, and she also added that she is ready to announce her decision about the adoption of the girl. But suddenly Leslie's stomach rumbled, and the Duchess realized that she had made a mistake, so she suggested that the lady have dinner with them tonight. The son of the princess heard the servants talking about the fact that her ladyship kidnapped Lady Leslie, and went to the room where the princess, along with the girl, dined. The heroine was delighted with the dinner, for it was much better than the one she had eaten this morning. The son of the princess came and said that he had heard that a guest had arrived. Princess Salvador said that this young lady was her daughter, and after this news, everyone was shocked, even Leslie herself. Beatrian asked that did he really have a sister he didn't know. The Duchess replied that from now on this lady was her daughter, and turning to Leslie said that he would be her older brother. The lad introduced himself as the commander of the Knightly Order of Lynch and said that his name was Betrion Lachin Salvador. The servants who watched this picture and thought that this is not the way to treat children, and because of the fact that Betrion is 2 heads taller than the average person, Miss Leslie may cry. The protagonist courageously stood up and also introduced herself to the lady and the Sparado family, because of which all the servants were delighted and thought that she was very polite. The Duchess said that this conversation between brother and sister was too formal and asked Beth how old he thought Lady Leslie was. Beatrian looked at the girl and assumed she was 5 years old. The servants were shocked at that answer and asked that didn't the lady look at least 10 and that 5 was too young. Betrian said that Anthe was about the same height when he was 4, but since Leslie is a girl, he is sure she is 5. That is a year older than Anthe. The protagonist replied that she was 12 years old, and after this answer, Betrian was greatly surprised. Seeing this picture, the princess laughed and thought that he should not have compared their family with normal people. Besides, she is thinner and smaller than other children her age. The princess told Leslie to come closer to her and apologized that her son didn't seem to get the hints, but there was another son named Anthe, but he would be late tonight. The princess asked if Leslie liked their food, and the girl said that it was wonderful, and she had never tasted anything so delicious before, and it seemed to her that such food was only eaten in heaven. The chef was touched by such praise because after 16 years of grief, he had not received praise from his hosts, and finally he deserved a reward. The princess asked the girl if the Marquis would look for her because it was already late. The protagonist thought that it was the first time she had noticed that the time had passed very quickly and said that it was all right, because she had asked Kucha to tell them that she would stay in the church and pray all night, so there was no need to worry about it. The princess said that it was fine because the girl would be able to spend the night at their house, but their house was not designed for many guests, but they always had a spare room. The princess pulled down the sleeve of the girl's dress and said that it was very serious early on, and that she had not been properly treated after that incident, and that it must have been very painful. The Duchess said she would ask the priest for treatment before Leslie left. The protagonist lay in bed and thought about how today had been like a dream. The priest examined Leslie's wound and said that it was a very serious burn, and he couldn't understand what evil person decided to leave such a wound unattended, and it looked like they had only had the smallest amount of help, and it was probably very painful. The priest raised his hand over the girl's hands and a glow appeared from them, which healed Leslie's hands. The protagonist was very happy that her hands were finally cured, and she decided to pinch herself to make sure it wasn't a dream. Leslie was surprised at how easily the princess accepted the child who had come to her unannounced, but she decided she'd better keep her guard up. Leslie had no idea what the princess would ask of her, and she already knew from history books how people treated children with strong magic, and so if she decided that she was not going to let herself be used anymore and was going to choose a different path. The main character was worth a lot more to discuss with her ladyship tomorrow and also has to get the deal right. And after a few seconds, the girl fell asleep. At that moment, Beatrian knocked on the princess's office to ask her about the girl and why she decided to choose a daughter from the Sparado family. Beatrian could not believe that the Duchess had chosen the Marquis's daughter and was sure there would be consequences. The princess replied that it wouldn't be easy since she'd accepted a man from such a powerful family as the Sparados. The son asked if she was so valuable that she was worth all the possible consequences, and the princess replied that Leslie had great potential that she could guarantee to Betrion. Besides, the princess had no choice, for the girl was begging her to survive, and she, as an adult, had to help her. 1,000 years after the founding of the empire, when the situation with the confrontation between humans and the empire worsened, a group called Etai appeared. The princess couldn't understand why they needed to destroy a small village. She told the soldiers that they would return as soon as they buried the bodies of the dead, and could not understand why they had to kill children and old people. When Leslie woke up, she was told that the princess was waiting for her downstairs. The maid was combing the girl's hair and asked her what kind of ribbon she wanted. The main character was very surprised that she could choose ribbons, and at that moment, the maid showed her a box with different and beautiful ribbons. Leslie found it hard to understand why her opinion was being asked, because no one had ever done it before. The maid told her to choose the ribbon she liked best, or if she wanted to, she could wear them all, or the one that looked best on her. Leslie took the green ribbon, and the maid said she thought the girl's blue one looked better on her. The girl said that she still wanted that ribbon, and the maid put it on Leslie's hair. The main character chose this particular ribbon because it was the same green as the princess's eyes. Leslie went downstairs, and the princess wished her good morning and asked if she had slept well. The girl replied that the room was very cozy and had everything she needed, and also thanked the princess for her hospitality and for the beautiful ribbon. The princess was very glad and invited the girl to sit down and have breakfast and then to discuss important matters. When breakfast began, the protagonist saw before her many delicious and beautiful dishes. The princess said that in their estate there were no etiquette rules for food, and so she could eat as much as she wanted. Leslie thanked for such kindness and also thanked the chef, who smiled radiantly at her. The girl noticed that there was no one else in the dining room but her and the Duchess, so she decided to ask where Sir Betrian was. The princess replied that the boy was probably having breakfast after his morning training. Leslie thought about the fact that when she came here she didn't see any of the family except the Duchess and Sir Betrian. The girl had eaten a small cake and was delighted with its sweet flavor, and all the servants admired the girl's cuteness. The Duchess said that they still had a lot to discuss, and since Leslie was a clever girl, she should understand what she would talk about, for the Duchess was thinking of adopting her. The protagonist thanked her for being so kind, but the Duchess replied that it wasn't worth it because she would use her as soon as the need arose. The princess explained that adopting a girl who is already the daughter of another noble house is quite problematic, especially if that family is Sparado. Usually, the reasons for adoption are due to inheritance or conception problems, and only in such cases are adoptions of children from another noble family considered. But since there are several families more powerful than the Sparados, the princess can afford it. But she needs time to prepare the basic paperwork if she wants to adopt Leslie, and she also needs to convince the emperor's family to adopt, and the rest of the nobility will probably try to stop her. After all, the princess already has a few enemies and they are quite annoying. But what is most important is Leslie's parents, and so the princess can't just take a peaceful girl away from her blood parents of close consent. The protagonist didn't think about her blood. She didn't feel like asking her parents' permission to do this. Leslie asked how long she would have to wait, and the princess said somewhere around a month. The girl thought about whether she could ask the princess to let her stay here because she wanted to stay here forever and never wanted to go back. The protagonist never wanted to see her parents, sister, and other servants again. The girl thought about the fact that if she started living here right away, there would be a disagreement between the Sparados and the Salvadores. The princess said that even the imperial family and other nobles would not be able to just approve it and settle it within a month. It was already very fast, and for the princess, it could end up being overworked. So if decided, she shouldn't ask for more than that. The princess asked Leslie if there was anyone in the Sparado family who knew of her abilities. The girl replied that her powers were known from her sister Ellie. The Duchess asked if Ellie would keep the secret, and the girl replied that she would definitely keep it secret, as she did not want Leslie to get the Marquis's attention. The princess said that if the girl's family found out about her magic, they would not let her go. And besides, Leslie could be pursued by something more powerful, such as a big two-headed snake. The big two-headed snake was the symbol of the Ricardius imperial family, and this snake might be different from normal snakes because this snake is very greedy. The princess had two requests to Leslie. First is that she should not let her know about its power anymore, and secondly, for the first month, she should try not to get injured or resist any injury inside the house. Also, if Leslie finds anything suspicious, she should immediately contact the princess, and if the princess cannot come herself, she will send her sons. Leslie asked what she should do now, but the princess replied that it was difficult to talk about such things yet, because it would not be safe to talk about it now, because there might be a traitor among them. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered how she had used her power against the Marquis and was afraid that he would realize everything and not let her go. Leslie began to worry a lot, but the princess calmed her down and told her that the girl now had her. After a while, the girl got into the carriage and drove back home. At that moment, Beatrice returned from training, and the Duchess said that it was somehow too long for a morning training session. The boy replied that he was still unaccustomed to such small creatures. The princess replied that nevertheless, he needed to get along with Leslie because she would soon be his sister, and she had hoped that she would be able to introduce Leslie to Sai and Anthe, but unfortunately neither of them were home at the moment. Sai must be very happy because during the princess's first pregnancy, he was very excited and wanted it to be a girl. They had even already picked out a name for the baby and wanted to call the girl Elizabeth and even set up the room. But in the end, Beatrice was born. The princess also informed her son that there seemed to be a rat under their roof because the Marquis of Sperato knew that she had sent people to orphanages. But thanks to that, the Duchess met Leslie, and the Marquis probably isn't even aware that the daughter he abandoned is so calm and grown up and has a bunch of plans in her little head. Beatrice replied that he would take care of it, and the Duchess replied that she was counting on him. When the protagonist returned home, she was greeted by her sister Ellie and indignantly asked where she'd been. Leslie replied that she had been at night prayers, but Ellie grabbed her arm and ordered her not to lie because she knew that she had never spent the whole night praying and why she had prayed so much that it had taken her so long. Leslie asked Ellie why she should know and why she should tell her, and Leslie didn't give a damn about what Ellie was doing and told her to stay out of her business. Her sister got very angry and said she would send someone to the church and Leslie's lies would come out. The protagonist thought about the fact that she had already been to church yesterday, so she had no need to continue this conversation with her. Suddenly, the Marquise came in and asked what all the noise was about and why her favorite daughter was screaming so much. At this point, Allie snuggled up to her mother and the Marquise started stroking her daughter's head, asking what made her beautiful daughter behave like this. Allie pointed at Leslie, and the Marquise got angry at the girl asking what she had done to her daughter. The protagonist thought about the fact that the Marquise said that Allie was her daughter, as if she wasn't the one who gave birth to Leslie, and yet she doesn't even consider her her own daughter. The girl turned away from the Marquise, and it made her angry, which made her want to take Leslie to the mirror room to punish her. She then grabbed the girl by the hair and wanted to drag her, but she only pulled out a strand of hair. The main character thought about how this all meant that she wasn't their child, but just a thing, and to be honest, she wished they were swallowed by the darkness. But despite all that, the girl had to hang on, because the Speratos deserved far more punishment. Leslie looked at the Marquise with angry eyes, and she said that the girl had lost her mind. The protagonist rushed to her room to keep her powers from breaking out. But most of all, she wanted revenge for those poor children who were victimized, and so she promised that she would avenge them all. The Marquise complained to the Marquise about Leslie saying that she had gone mad, and something must have happened to her head when she fell off the cliff. The Marquis replied that the Marquise should calm down because Leslie was just a little brat, and they could easily lock her in her room until the next time she woke up. The Marquise said that her look was very creepy, and her behavior had become disgusting. Before, she couldn't say a word to the servants, but now she was just using them. Also, Leslie had set a trap for Rhea, and as the nanny said, she could have strung the rope beforehand, but it looked like she had hidden it, but they couldn't find it no matter how hard they looked. The Marquise also added that Rhea kept saying that the rope had vanished like magic. The Marquise seriously thought about the words of the Marquise that it could be magic, and began to look for information about whether it was possible to give birth to two children with the same power and whether the victim could awaken the power. It was the fate of the Sperato family, and babies with golden hair and green eyes are destined to lead the peaks, and it is such children who are most likely to awaken their powers. This could be confirmed when the second and third child were born, and if the next child had silver hair, they would be the sacrifice and their strength would be passed on to the firstborn. Marquis thought about that. However, if Leslie's power has awakened, then the one who will bring glory to the family is her, and not Ellie. And if what happened recently was dark magic, then that means she is strong enough to attack other people. The Marquis has decided to continue planning Ellie's wedding to the prince and will send Leslie to the front lines, and that way they will get a dowry from the royal family as well as rewards during each martial law. If Ellie couldn't marry a member of the royal family, then Leslie would be able to solve the problem, and so the Marquis could get lands, fame, and wealth. The Marquis believed that the other Marquises were no longer his equal, and even Salvatore would not be able to resist him. The Marquis wanted to make sure that Leslie had power, and he was thinking of ways to test it. Suddenly, the Marquis came across a book and couldn't understand what it was doing right in his library. This book was in an ancient language, and it said that if a blonde child was born with power, a gray-haired child would be born next. But that wasn't always the case. He thought that there was nothing new here. But suddenly he froze when he read the line about how children with golden hair had weak magic, so it could hardly be of any use. Also in the book, it was said that they were thinking about where they could find a use for their magic, and after much research they had discovered that if you threw them into a fire, their power would be transferred to another child with magic. However, there can be exceptions. That is, if the power of silver-haired children is 10, then the power of golden-haired children is only 7. At this moment, the Marquis realized that the second Lord of Darkness had awakened. The next morning, Rhea brought Leslie a beautiful dress, and the girl could not understand what had suddenly happened to them. The servants wished her good morning and offered her a delicious breakfast, and it was all very strange. Rhea said that this dress of a beautiful purple color was a gift from the Marquis, and it would no doubt look wonderful on Leslie. The girl remembered that the dress belonged to Ellie and asked if she knew about it, because she could make a scene. Rhea answered that of course Ellie knows about it, but the older sister gives the younger one a part of her things, and it would be unthinkable if their kind Ellie would have a tantrum about it. The main character remembered how in the past, Ellie had torn her clothes that she had grown out of just to avoid giving them to Leslie, and so the girl couldn't believe that Ellie was just giving her clothes away. Leslie told Rhea to leave because she was tired and wanted to sleep. Rhea said that Leslie couldn't not go because Marquis had called her to eat together. The protagonist was surprised and asked if the Marquis really wanted her in the dining room too. The nanny said that Leslie should call the Marquis Papa, but the girl ordered her to stop that nonsense. Rhea said it had been a long time since Leslie had eaten with everyone else, and also the Marquis said there would be lots of freshly prepared food today from recipes she liked. Leslie covered herself with a blanket and said that she wasn't going anywhere and that she didn't want to see Marquis. Rhea said that if she didn't go downstairs, the nanny would be punished and asked her not to be cranky and to go eat with them. The girl realized that because the Marquis was strict with the servants, they were so nice to Leslie and still agreed to go to lunch. The protagonist needed to find out what the Marquis was up to and added that she would not wear that dress. When Leslie came downstairs, Ellie saw her and was very angry because her favorite dress was missing, and now Leslie was sitting there. Her sister was angry and asked why she was sitting here because it was her place and why she was here at all. Allie wanted to grab the girl by the hair and throw her off the table, but Marquis stopped her and said she was embarrassing him. Ellie didn't understand what was going on because her daddy had never been mad at her and said that Leslie had taken her place and her favorite dishes were on the table. Marquis replied that trying to hit his sister just because of the dishes was too much and that he was disappointed in Allie. At that point, Marquis turned to Leslie and called her dear daughter and then asked if she had slept well. He also asked why the girl didn't wear the purple dress because he had given it to her because it suited her eyes, and even if she didn't like it, he could buy her many new and beautiful dresses. Ellie was outraged and asked if the Marquis had just given her her favorite purple dress, not that he knew how much she liked it. The Marquis ordered Ellie to shut up and told her that she needed to be nicer to her sister and share her things with her, and that she was also bullying Leslie suspiciously often. Marquis then turned to Marquise and said that he was disappointed in her too, because their child, who is only 10 years old, is skinny, and he couldn't understand what Marquise had been doing all this time. Marquise couldn't understand what he was talking about and why he was talking to her like that. Marquise turned to Leslie and told her not to worry about anything else because her daddy would protect her. The main character said she was 12 years old, not 10. Also, the girl couldn't understand what he was up to. Marquis was scared and asked what she was talking about because it was his duty as a father to make sure his daughter was happy. Leslie replied that he never did that because he usually beat her, shouted and locked her in a room, and recently he had even left burns. Marquis replied that he was wrong and understood why she didn't trust him because her father had suddenly risen to show kindness and care. He tried to convince Leslie that he had done all these things because he cared for her, and he had also recently realized how badly he had treated her, and after reflecting on it, he was completely remorseful. Marquis apologized to Leslie, who didn't realize the value of the girl. The protagonist got up from the table and told him not to dare beg her forgiveness because she had not the slightest desire to accept his apology. Leslie yanked the Marquis and told him that she would never forgive him in her life, after which she promptly left. The protagonist was worried that whether he had found out that her powers had been awakened. The girl reassured herself that the darkness is very difficult to detect because it is not as conspicuous as magic or the power of light. This power silently hides as if it did not exist at all. It slowly absorbs and then disappears. The girl decided that if she didn't use it, no one would know she had it, but those who had it could feel it. At that moment, Ellie came running in and indignantly asked if Leslie had told the Marquis everything. The girl replied that she had not told him anything and thought that Ellie had told him everything. The sister replied that Leslie thought she was crazy enough to make her happy. The protagonist asked how, in that case, the Marquis could know about her power, or was Ellie so stupid that she had told him everything? Ellie got angry and swung to hit Leslie, but suddenly her hand froze because the dark power wouldn't let her do it. Leslie told Ellie to try and stay out of each other's way, and the girl left. Meanwhile, Marquis was raging in his room because he almost bowed in front of Leslie, and in return he got a haughty attitude. Marquis thought that if she is his daughter, then she should obey him, after which he started smashing things that were around him. Rhea, who was in his room, listened to all this and thought that Leslie was getting her in a lot of trouble. Marquis asked if Rhea had talked to her about him, and Nanny replied that they had discussed Marquis with Leslie, but her reaction was negative. Marquis was furious and said that Nanny should make her think good thoughts about him, then grabbed Rhea by the shoulders and asked if she knew anything unusual. Nanny replied that she had once noticed Leslie's fear of fire, and the Marquis had gotten the crazy idea to use it again. The Marquis decided that she should throw Leslie into the fire, and that way she would be sure to use her power to try to survive, then he could confirm his hunch. At that moment, a servant came into the room and said that the Marquis wished to speak to the Marquis about going to the temple. After all, the day of prayer, which she regularly attended, would be tomorrow. The Marquis replied to let her handle it herself because he was busy, but at that very second he changed his mind and decided to go to the temple after all. The Marquis was definitely up to something, and he wanted to take Leslie with him. The main character was having breakfast, and suddenly Rhea told her that Leslie could go to the temple today because the days spent together in prayer are very important for the family. The Marquis also said that Leslie could go in a separate carriage if she wanted to, and the girl agreed because she didn't care where she was. The main thing was not in this mansion, because behind its walls she could breathe peacefully. The protagonist rode in the carriage and could not believe that the Marquis really allowed to go alone. It was a bit suspicious, but without Rhea and the Marquis, she was really calm here. Leslie could not believe that she had lived in this mansion for 12 years, because it had only been a few days, but she already wanted to return to the princess. The Marquis, along with the Marquise and Ellie, were riding together in a carriage, and suddenly it stopped. The Marquis paid the men with axes in their hands and then ordered them to return home. The Marquise couldn't stand it and screamed why the Marquis was behaving so strangely and was always hanging around this child, and also suddenly canceled the trip to the temple. She also wondered why he had called these people and why they were holding axes. Marquis told her not to worry and everything would go fine, and besides, he wasn't doing it for his own benefit, he was doing it for Ellie and the whole Sperado family. Marquis also added that the axes are precautions in case of fire, and there is no reason to worry. Ellie couldn't understand what he was talking about, but then she remembered that the carriage Leslie was getting into was kind of dirty. The protagonist hoped that this month would go by quickly and wanted to pray that the time would pass quickly. Leslie thought about the fact that everyone calls her the Princess of Monsters, and she does not find instead because she is not around. Suddenly, the carriage stopped, and the girl could not understand what was happening, then knocked to ask what was wrong, but no one answered. Leslie wanted to open the door, but it did not open, and at that moment, the carriage caught fire. The main character was very scared, and she didn't know what to do, so she thought she should use her power. At that moment, She heard the voice of Sperado's servant outside the door and realized that this was all built for her powers to manifest. Leslie was lying on the floor and decided that she would rather destroy the place than die. But suddenly someone ripped the door open and pulled the girl out of the burning carriage. As it turned out, it was Betrion who courageously saved the girl. A guy turned to Betrion and said that he realized that the girl was in more danger, but ripping the door off the hinges with his bare hands was very dangerous. Another of the guys said that he didn't think that girl was telling the truth anyway. It turned out that some time ago, a girl had approached the knights and said that there was a burning carriage on the road to the temple. The knights asked how she knew this, but the girl replied that she had accidentally found out, and they immediately needed to save this child before she used her power. After that, the mysterious girl ran away and Betrion saw her golden hair. Now Betrion knew that it was probably a planned assassination. Suddenly, the knights were approached by a group of axe-wielding mercenaries who thanked them for saving their miss and demanded her back. Betrion handed Leslie to another knight and grabbed the man by the throat and said that no matter how cold it was today, he didn't have a drop of sweat on him, as if to imply that he wasn't in a big hurry to help Leslie. The knight also added that it was as if they knew the carriage would be on fire and had taken their axes with them. The mercenaries started making excuses and said that it was a simple accident, and they took those axes just in case. The knights told them not to lie, and assuming it was indeed an accident, then why was the door blocked with timbers, and why was it locked with a latch? The bandits ran at the knights with axes and said it didn't matter, and demanded their miss back, calling the knights kidnappers. At this point, Bat said that they were the 3rd Night Squad of the Imperial Army, the Lynch Squad, and he was the commander of that squad, and his name was Betrion Salvador. Startled at what they had just heard, Betrion said that they called his knights kidnappers, but can they answer to take responsibility for their words? One of the knights asked how they dared to insult them and demanded to name their master because he should be punished for not disciplining his subordinates properly. After that, the bandits rushed deep into the forest, and the knights did not pursue them. One of the knights said that Betrion seemed to know the child, and he replied that it was his sister. Leslie had terrible dreams of being devoured by fire, and at that moment she woke up and saw the princess. The girl said that Sir Betrion had saved her, and the Duchess confirmed it. She also said that Leslie was not seriously injured, but she had a few first-degree burns, and that was why she had invited the priests. The Duchess handed the girl a glass of medicine that would help her sleep better, because right now she needed sleep and nothing more. The protagonist said she needed to thank Sir Betrion, and the Duchess said she would tell him if she didn't want to sleep because she was afraid of seeing that terrible dream, and asked if the contract between her and the princess had been made. The Duchess replied that there was a contract between them. Leslie said that she was glad, and had read in a book that a contract is a promise that must be kept, and on the basis of that promise, a contract must also be made. The Duchess understood why this tiny child was striving hard to come here to offer her a contract. The girl asked if the princess would always be on her side and if she would ask her into the fire. The princess replied that of course, according to their contract, she would always be at her side and could stay by her side until she fell asleep. When the princess left the girl's room, she asked how the condition of Betrion's hand was, and he replied that the priests had examined and cured it at once. The princess said that the Marquis of Sperado had crossed the line, and Betrion agreed with his mother, saying that he seemed quite out of his mind, and he would never have thought the Marquis capable of setting fire to a carriage. The princess could not guess why the Marquis had done it, but she recalled the words of her grandfather and grandmother, who had once said that the second sons and daughters of the Sperado family often passed away unusually early. There had been few deaths lately. After all, grandfather had said it was all long past, and besides, they usually didn't have to take an interest in the affairs of other families. But this girl was not out of the princess's mind, and she decided she needed to pay the Marquis of Sperado a visit. Ellie was in her room thinking that she had made the right choice to save Leslie and seek help from the knights. At that moment, there was a knock on her room and said that the Marquis had made a real mayhem. It turned out that the Marquis was berating the bandits for missing Leslie, but the bandits started saying that those guys turned out to be Lynch Knights, and the broad-shouldered guy said he was Betrion Salvador. Allie wondered if there would be a problem because she had gone to them for help specifically and hoped that Leslie would undoubtedly not even try to go back. Allie feared that her parents would love Leslie instead of her, and Allie would be the victim. Suddenly, a servant came in and said that Princess Salvador had arrived and said she wanted to speak to the Marquis. The princess was waiting in the room, and suddenly Ellie entered and greeted the princess. The Duchess asked how old Ellie was, and she replied that she was 15 years old, and so the Duchess concluded that she was big enough for her age. Soon, the Marquis came in and apologized for keeping the Duchess waiting and believed she was here about the incident with her daughter. The Marquis said that their carriage was far away, so he had to learn about the incident much later, and he thanked Princess Salvador for her help and apologized for her time. The Marquis said that he had heard about the incident from the servants, and they had run away because they were afraid of the burning carriage, and just then, the knights came to help. But he had warned them to be careful with fire and promised to teach them a lesson. The Marquis inquired exactly where his daughter was, but the princess asked if she was really his daughter. The Marquis twitched an eyebrow and said that of course she was his daughter, and asked not to be misunderstood since she was his second child. The princess said that she had not seen the Sparado coat of arms on her carriage, but the Marquis justified himself by saying that he was in a hurry to give her a smaller carriage because she did not want to ride in the same one as them. The Marquis also added that it was just when children rebel and argue with their parents that she chose this carriage for herself. The Duchess said that the child was not interested in an elaborate carriage, and instead, her choice was the smallest, unremarkable, and oiled one. The Duchess also said that the Marquis had a beautiful daughter of whom he was so proud, that is, Miss Ellie Darren Sparado. Ellie came out to say hello to the princess while she waited for the Marquis and showed her the mansion, and unlike the Salvador estate, their house is very elegant and traditional, just like a palace. The Marquis said that perhaps their mansion has a really rich history. The Duchess said that the Marquis is always here in his palace, but to love his children as much as he does is very rare, and was quite surprised to hear rumors about Sparado buying an entire clothing store for his daughter. The Marquis said that this was indeed the case, and the princess said that she was right. From the dressing room to the library, even a beautiful greenhouse for Ellie, and there was a great deal in the mansion, but nothing for the other child. The Duchess found neither her dresses nor any trace of her, as if there were only one child living here. So she decided to ask him if Miss Leslie was really his daughter, or if he had raised her for some other purpose. The Marquis said she had no idea where she had heard that, but the princess said her grandfather had told her when she was a child, and he said that often the second and third children of a family with a pirate died at an early age, and it was quite strange, and they all had silver hair. The Marquis jumped up from his seat and asked how much she knew. The Duchess thought it was risky because she wasn't sure if all the children had silver hair, but her grandfather had told her a little about the case. The Duchess said she knew something for sure, that the Marquis had raised Mrs. Leslie not as a daughter, but for something else, and that he had tried to kill her many times. The Marquis said that she was his daughter and belonged to her parents, so he had a right to do whatever he wanted with her. The princess said he was talking nonsense and saying terrible things. The Marquis said that if the princess did not return her now, he would take his knights and storm the Salvador estate, and then he would challenge the princess to a duel and kill her. The Duchess pushed the Marquis and told him that he is free to do what he wants and is sure to have a great time and will personally break his bones with her own hands and count every minute until that day. The protagonist woke up in her room and was glad she was alive, and it was all just a dream. Leslie remembered the events that had happened to her yesterday and was embarrassed that she had asked the princess to sit with her until she fell asleep, because she was no longer a child. At that moment, voices were heard outside the door, and Leslie quickly pretended to be asleep. Beatrion then came into the room, but there was another man with him. Beth said she was still asleep, and the man confirmed this by saying that her little eyes were still closed. The man called the Marquis a fool, and if he was on the battlefield, he would take the opportunity to give him a good punch. Bat replied that even if there was chaos, it would be the knights and mercenaries who would be on the battlefield, not him. Leslie opened one eye, and the man saw that she was awake. The protagonist was frightened and ran into Beatrion's arms, but he rushed to calm her down and told her that it was his father. The man became very upset and asked if he had such a scary face, and covered his face with his hands and then covered himself with his cloak. Leslie thought he was so huge like a bear, not that any of the adults had ever tried to please her before. The protagonist introduced herself and thought about how she wasn't afraid of him. The man lit up with happiness and said his name was Siren Delpha Salvador, who was the husband of Acela and Benken Salvador, and the father of Batreon and Ruenta. Siren was very happy to welcome Leslie into his family.